always craved true solitude, that deep, unsettling quiet you only find far, far away from everything. That's why I chose Blackwood Lake, a place so remote, even the park rangers barely remembered it. I thought I'd finally found peace, a genuine escape from the clamor of the world. I set up my sturdy green tent by the still, dark water of Blackwood Lake, miles from any established trail. The absolute silence of the wilderness was profound, broken only by the gentle crackle of my small campfire and the soft, almost reverent rustle of leaves in the unseen breeze. Above, the stars were unbelievably bright, a glittering expanse I rarely saw back home. Day one was perfect. I spent hours fishing from the shore, reading a worn paperback, and simply existing. I felt completely at ease, truly alone in nature's embrace. As the first night descended, a new sound pierced the tranquil quiet. A faint, rhythmic thumping began far off in the woods, almost like a distant, irregular drumbeat. It was subtle at first, easily dismissible. I rationalized it as an animal, a deer perhaps, pawing at the ground, or maybe a beaver slapping its tail in the distant inlet. The sound faded in and out, never quite consistent enough to pinpoint. The next morning, I woke to the crisp chill of the mountain air. As I stretched, I noticed something new at the edge of my campsite. A small, makeshift cairn of stones stood near the water's edge, neatly stacked. It definitely hadn't been there yesterday. A prickle of unease ran down my spine, a tiny jolt in my carefully constructed sense of solitude. I told myself a previous camper must have left it, perhaps a hiker who passed through quickly. I kicked the stones down, scattering them, trying to dismiss the strange feeling. Later that day, I ventured out for a hike on a narrow, overgrown path I'd spotted. The sun dappled through the dense canopy, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. As I walked, an overwhelming sensation of being watched began to creep over me. It was a visceral feeling, like eyes boring into my back from the shadows. Every time I stopped to listen, to catch a telltale sound, the subtle rustling in the bushes nearby seemed to pause too, only to resume its quiet symphony the moment I moved again. A cold shiver ran through me, despite the warmth of the day, and I instinctively sped up my pace, my heart beginning to pound a little harder in my chest. When I finally returned to camp, as dusk began to settle, the thumping sound had returned. Tonight, it was noticeably closer, a heavier, more deliberate beat that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my feet. And then I saw it. The cairn was back. It stood larger this time, precisely outside my tent flap, the stones meticulously restacked, a silent, undeniable presence. My stomach dropped with a sickening lurch. This wasn't an animal, and I certainly hadn't left it there. My sense of peace shattered, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Panic began to set in. I started to pack frantically, my hands fumbling with buckles and straps, my mind racing through a million possibilities, none of them good. But the sun was setting rapidly, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples that felt more menacing than beautiful. The fading light made the dense woods feel like a solid, impenetrable wall. I made the desperate decision to wait until morning to make my escape. Navigating these woods in pitch blackness was a recipe for disaster. As darkness swallowed the last vestiges of daylight, I started hearing soft, almost whispering voices from the woods, just beyond the reach of my campfire's flickering light. They sounded hushed, like they were discussing something, or someone. My name, I thought I heard my name. A faint, breathy whisper carried on the night air. I snatched my powerful headlamp from my bag, clicking it on with a trembling finger, and shone its beam wildly into the encroaching darkness. The whispering stopped instantly, cut off as if by an invisible switch. The light sliced through the trees, illuminating nothing but ancient trunks and tangled undergrowth. There was nothing there, no discernible source for the voices, only the deep, unsettling quiet of the forest. I felt a knot of pure terror tighten in my gut, huddled inside my tent, every nerve ending screaming. I clutched my hunting knife in my trembling hand. The thumping was now right outside my tent, a heavy, dull impact against the earth, accompanied by soft, dragging sounds that seemed to circle my campsite slowly, deliberately. It sounded like something large, something heavy, being pulled through the dry leaves and twigs. My breath hitched in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to make it disappear, but the sounds persisted, closing in. Suddenly, something brushed against my tent fabric, a distinct pressure that wasn't wind, a solid touch against the thin nylon shell just inches from my face. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, so hard I thought it might burst. A moment later, I saw it, a clear handprint, pressed into the dew on the outside of the tent. It was perfectly visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, a ghostly silhouette against the dark fabric. It was far too big to be my hand, far too big to be any human hand I had ever seen. I bolted from the tent, adrenaline surging through my veins, pushing away the paralyzing fear. I didn't grab my pack, didn't even think about the abandoned gear. I just grabbed my car keys, clutched them like a lifeline, and ran blindly through the woods in the dark, tripping and falling over unseen roots and rocks, twigs snapping loudly underfoot with every desperate stride. I ran until my lungs burned, until the dark trees seemed to thin just slightly, until I finally reached my car, a beacon of safety in the oppressive night. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, locked all 4 doors with a frantic click, and sped away down the lonely, unpaved dirt road, leaving everything behind. As I drove, my headlights cut through the inky blackness. I risked a glance in the rearview mirror, and there it was. A tall, shadowy figure standing perfectly still by my now abandoned tent, watching me go. It was just a silhouette against the darkness, but its posture, its sheer stillness, filled me with an absolute, primal dread that made my blood run cold. It felt like it was waving goodbye. I eventually made it home, safe, but deeply traumatized, the images of the woods and the handprint seared into my mind. A few days later, still jumpy, I was finally unpacking the last of my camping gear. As I pulled my sleeping bag from my pack, something hard clinked inside. I shook it out, and a small, intricately carved wooden effigy tumbled onto the floor. It was crudely but recognizably shaped like a human figure, and it definitely wasn't there when I packed my bag. My breath caught in my throat. It looked exactly like me, down to my messy hair, the same faded shirt I wore on day 1. Just as I dropped it in horror, the tiny wooden eyes seeming to stare up at me, I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere outside my window. It sounded just like a heart, beating slowly, deliberately, keeping time. My friends and I thought we'd found the perfect digital detox. a rustic cabin deep in the redwoods. Absolutely no cell service, just us and nature. It was supposed to be a fun, isolated escape, a chance to reconnect without the constant pull of the digital world. That's what we told ourselves, anyway, laughing about the forced disconnection. We rented an old, charmingly rustic cabin in a secluded part of the Redwood National Park. The owner's email had mentioned respecting the cabin's history, which we just chuckled about, assuming it was a quirky note about antique furniture. The first night was great, a roaring campfire outside, drinks flowing, our laughter echoing freely through the ancient, towering trees. We felt completely cut off from the world in the best possible way, ready for a week of peace. That night, after everyone else had finally settled down and fallen asleep, Liam complained about hearing faint scratching noises coming from inside the walls of his bedroom. He nudged me awake, his voice a low, worried whisper. We both listened for a moment. It was subtle, like tiny nails dragging across wood. I rolled over, telling him it was just mice, or maybe the old house settling in the wind, trying to soothe his nerves and my own. The next day, we went for a long, invigorating hike through the majestic redwood groves. The air was crisp, the silence profound. When we returned to the cabin a few hours later, a chill snaked up my spine. The cabin's front door was slightly ajar, despite us being absolutely certain we had locked it securely before we left. We stood there, looking at each other, a flicker of unease passing between us. We blamed the old latch and a strong gust of wind, brushing off the incident with forced bravado. That evening, as the sun dipped below the colossal trees, casting long, eerie shadows, we started noticing something else. Small, almost imperceptible handprints had appeared on the dusty window panes. Low to the ground, they were tiny, barely visible smudges, almost like a child's. We joked about the cabin having child ghosts, trying to lighten the mood, but the laughter felt strained, brittle. Sarah, always the most sensitive among us, started complaining about intense cold spots in random parts of the cabin, even when the fireplace was roaring, spitting warmth into the main room. She swore she saw fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision, darting just out of focus, just beyond her sight. Tom, ever the one to capture moments, tried to get some rustic charm footage for social media, but his phone battery kept draining almost instantly every time he tried to record, going from full to dead in minutes. He muttered, frustrated, that the air felt unusually heavy inside the cabin, almost suffocating, as if a weight pressed down on us. The mood shifted, becoming somber, nervous. Night 2 arrived, bringing with it a palpable change in the cabin's atmosphere. The faint scratching in the walls became significantly louder, more insistent, moving from room to room with a terrifying deliberation, like something was trying to claw its way out. We could all hear it now, a sickening sound of wood splintering, accompanied by faint, choked whispering that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the old house. It wasn't just mice. This was something larger, something desperate. We decided we had to leave immediately. The scratching and whispering were too much, too unsettling to ignore any longer. We rushed outside to the cabin's old, rusted truck, which had worked perfectly fine for our initial drive-in. Tom fumbled with the keys, but it refused to start. The engine just groaned, a pathetic, dying sound, each attempt met with silence. Our hearts plummeted. No cell service meant no calling for help. We were trapped as we stood there, frozen in fear. A sudden, violent banging started on the front door of the cabin, shaking the entire structure on its foundations. The sound was deafening, primal, like someone was trying to force their way in, or perhaps desperately trying to get out, clawing and pounding against the weathered wood. We scrambled back inside, bolting the door, but it felt futile. The cabin groaned and shuddered around us, a living, protesting thing. Liam, visibly shaking, his face pale and drawn, pointed a trembling finger at an old, faded family photograph on the mantel. It was a portrait from the early 1900s, showing a stern-faced couple with 3 children. But there was a 5th person, partially obscured behind the family, a small child whose face was violently scratched out, a jagged tear through the sepia image. And then he noticed that the scratched-out face bore an uncanny, horrifying resemblance to Sarah. The violent banging on the door suddenly stopped. An oppressive, profound, suffocating silence descended upon the cabin, heavier and more menacing than any noise. The air grew impossibly cold. Then Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream from the bedroom, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. We rushed in to find her standing rigid, wide-eyed, and terrified, staring at her reflection in a cracked mirror that hung on the wall. Her reflection had a faint, angry red scratch mark across its face, perfectly mirroring the violently scratched-out face in the old photograph on the mantel. As we desperately tried to comfort her, her face contorted in a silent scream. We heard it. A child's mournful crying, a soft, heartbroken sound coming from the attic directly above us. The crying slowly, deliberately, began to descend the stairs, the sound growing closer with each agonizing step. We didn't wait. In a desperate, adrenaline-fueled attempt, Tom managed to get the truck started. On the next try, we piled in, scrambling over each other, and sped away down the winding dirt road, not daring to look back, the sounds of crying fading behind us. Days later, back home, the horror of the cabin had begun to recede, but its effects lingered. Sarah started exhibiting disturbing behaviors. She talked to herself in hushed tones, whispered things no one else could hear, and constantly complained about a persistent itch on her face, rubbing at it compulsively. One morning, she woke up with a deep, angry scratch across her cheek, perfectly matching the one in the photograph. It was clearly self-inflicted, but she had no memory of doing it. The next time we tried to gather to talk about what happened, we discovered that Liam had vanished without a trace. No one knew where he went, his phone left behind, his car still in his driveway, and then, on the passenger side window of my own car, there was a faint, almost imperceptible child's handprint, pressed into the dust, just like the ones on the cabin windows. I'd spent years dreaming of this, a week-long solo backpacking trip deep into the untouched Rockies, far from any human trace. I craved the challenge, the absolute freedom that comes from relying solely on yourself in the vast wilderness. What I found, instead, was something far worse than any wild animal, something that would follow me home. I was 3 days into my week-long solo backpacking trip in a remote section of the Rockies. Pristine wilderness stretched for miles in every direction, a breathtaking tapestry of towering peaks and dense forests. I hadn't seen another soul since leaving the trailhead, and I relished the quiet, the physical challenge, the feeling of being completely alone and self-sufficient. I set up camp near a small, unnamed stream, the gurgling water the only sound for miles, feeling utterly content with my solitude. As I was filtering water from the stream, lost in the rhythmic pump of my filter, I heard a rustle in the bushes nearby. I looked up, expecting to see a deer or a squirrel. Instead, a man emerged, silently, seemingly out of nowhere, as if he had simply materialized from the dense foliage. He was oddly dressed for backpacking, worn, old-fashioned clothes that looked like they belonged to another era, and no visible pack on his back. He just stood there, motionless, watching me with an unsettling stillness, his eyes wide and unblinking. He introduced himself as Jed. His voice was low and flat, devoid of any warmth. His eyes were unsettlingly vacant, like black pools, yet he seemed to know things about me that were impossible. He spoke of where I started my hike, how many days I had been out, even specific details about my gear, my bright orange tent, the brand of my water filter, things he couldn't have possibly seen from a distance. A cold dread began to settle in my stomach. He then warned me, in the same low, flat voice, about the old path ahead, saying it was not meant for strangers. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any explanation. He just delivered the chilling message with an unnerving calm. Then, as quietly and unnaturally as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, melting back into the dense foliage without a sound, leaving me alone with a profound chill despite the warm afternoon sun. I tried to shake off the encounter, but Jed's words echoed in my mind. I checked my worn topo map. Sure enough, there actually was an old, faint, unmarked path branching off my planned trail, a barely visible line on the paper, but it wasn't on my official park map. I decided firmly to stick to my planned, safe route, dismissing Jed as a harmless, if eccentric, recluse. That night, as the campfire crackled and the stars emerged, I heard a faint, rhythmic whistling echoing through the valley. It sounded like a lullaby, haunting and ethereal, but it was deeply unnerving. The sound seemed to circle my camp, getting closer and then retreating, making it impossible to pinpoint its source or direction. The next morning, the sun rose, but it brought no comfort. I found a small, perfectly carved wooden bird sitting on a rock outside my tent, placed there with deliberate care. I knew instantly Jed had left it. It was exquisitely detailed, but its tiny, vacant eyes were exactly like his, staring out into the wilderness. A wave of fear washed over me. He had been here while I slept. He was watching me. I decided to hike faster, to get off this trail as quickly as possible, to put as much distance between myself and Jed as I could. As I walked, every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. I kept seeing fleeting glimpses of movement in the trees, always just out of sight, just behind me, or just around the next bend. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum. I started running, pushing myself, needing to escape the invisible presence. I passed a gnarled, ancient tree, its bark twisted and scarred by centuries. Carved deeply into its bark was a crude, unfamiliar symbol, jagged and sharp. Below it, in what looked like fresh scratches, was my full name. My blood ran cold. The air grew heavy, suffocating. He knew my name. He had carved it into the tree. He was playing with me. I heard distinct footsteps behind me, not my own. Heavy, deliberate, crunching on leaves. I spun around, clutching my trekking pole like a weapon, my breath ragged. Nothing. The woods were still, deceptively silent. But then the whistling started again, closer this time, just around the bend ahead, waiting for me. It was the same mournful lullaby, a chilling invitation. I burst into a small clearing, expecting to see Jed, ready to confront him, but it was empty. The silence was deafening. In the center of the clearing, however, was a small, carefully arranged pile of my own gear, my spare socks, a specific brand of protein bar I had packed just for this trip, my worn hiking journal. Items I was absolutely certain were still in my backpack, which now felt suspiciously lighter on my shoulders. I frantically checked my backpack, ripping it open with trembling hands. My GPS device was gone. My satellite phone was missing. The main contents of my pack were still there, but key survival items had been selectively and deliberately removed. I was lost, truly lost, and cut off. I fled the clearing, running blindly now, powered by pure adrenaline and raw terror, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the scratches and scrapes. I ran until my legs burned, until I finally stumbled onto a gravel road, miles from where I should be. It was a miracle. I flagged down a passing car, utterly traumatized. A wild, incoherent story tumbling from my lips. I got home, shaken but safe, the memory of the woods a raw wound. Weeks later, I started receiving anonymous packages. Inside were meticulously detailed drawings of my specific camping spots, my tent, my campfire, all rendered with an unnerving precision. Each drawing featured a small, almost hidden figure in the background, watching me from the shadows. The final package contained my missing GPS device and satellite phone. Attached was a note, crudely written in block letters. "You should have taken the old path. We were waiting." I never went backpacking alone again. But sometimes, when I'm home, late at night, I hear a faint, rhythmic whistling from outside my window, a tune I now recognize as the same one I heard in the woods. And when I check my front porch, there's always a new, small wooden carving waiting for me. A different animal each time, all with vacant, unsettling eyes, and I begin to wonder if Jed was ever just one person, or if they're still waiting for me to take the old path.